This is the story of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought over 4 days in October 1944 across more than 100,000 square miles of Philippine waters. Over 200,000 naval personnel and nearly 300 ships clashed in what became the largest naval battle in history, and when the guns finally fell silent on October 26th, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. What makes this battle stand out isn't just the sheer scale of it all. A heavily outgunned American task force of escort carriers and destroyers suddenly found themselves staring down the most powerful battleships ever built. Divided command nearly handed Japan a victory despite overwhelming American advantages, and decisions made in the confusion of combat continue to fuel arguments among historians 80 years after the fact. We need to start with why this massive engagement happened in the first place. Japan was losing the war by October 1944, but defeat hadn't arrived yet. The Battle of the Philippine Sea back in June had cost them approximately 600 aircraft and 3 carriers, leaving their naval air power badly depleted. What they still possessed was a fleet of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and the willingness to stake everything on one final gamble. The Philippines held the key to everything. These islands controlled the sea lanes connecting Japan to vital oil supplies in Borneo and the Dutch East Indies, and without that oil, the remaining Japanese fleet would become nothing more than expensive steel rusting at anchor. American planners understood this perfectly, and General Douglas MacArthur was finally making good on the promise he'd made in 1942 when he evacuated and declared, "I shall return." MacArthur's forces hit Leyte Island on October 20th, 1944. More than 130,000 troops came ashore at Tacloban and Dulag that day, and the invasion was underway. Japan's answer came in the form of Operation Sho-Go I, their last desperate plan to save the Philippines, and with them any realistic hope of continuing the war. The plan was complex, maybe too complex for a navy that had already lost most of its experienced pilots. 3 separate surface forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions, all timed to arrive simultaneously, with one simple goal in mind: destroy the American transports and the beachhead before it could be secured. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, the most powerful group, which included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi. These were the largest battleships ever built, and Kurita would bring them through the San Bernardino Strait to fall on the American landing beaches from the north. Coming from the south through Surigao Strait would be Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, leading the southern force, with Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima following behind in a second smaller force. And then came the decoy. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the northern force, 4 carriers that looked impressive on paper but carried almost no aircraft. His mission was simple: be seen, lure the American carriers north, away from Leyte Gulf, and give Kurita's battleships a clear path to the invasion beaches. Everything depended on precise timing, perfect coordination, and more than a little luck. Admiral Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, sent his forces into battle with these words: "With confidence in heavenly guidance, the entire force will attack." Kurita's message to his officers before they sailed was equally fatalistic. Would it not be a shame to have the fleet remain intact while our nation perishes? You must all remember there are such things as miracles. They were going to need one, and here's why. No single American commander controlled the forces defending the Philippines. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded the 7th Fleet under MacArthur, while Admiral William Bull Halsey commanded the 3rd Fleet under Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. 2 fleets operating in the same waters, with 2 separate chains of command. and this divided structure would nearly prove catastrophic. Darkness still covered the water when the battle began just after 1 in the morning on October 23rd, as the submarine USS Darter picked up Kurita's center force on radar in Palawan Passage. Darter and her sister boat Dace maneuvered into position for the kill. 4 torpedoes from Darter slammed into Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago, at 5:24 a.m., and the ship went down so fast that Kurita had to swim for his life. 10 minutes later, Darter crippled another heavy cruiser named Takao with 2 more torpedoes, and at 5:56 Dace sent 4 fish into the heavy cruiser Maya, which sank within minutes. Less than half an hour of action had put 2 Japanese heavy cruisers on the bottom and left a third limping back to Brunei. Kurita transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato and pressed on eastward, but his force had already taken casualties and the Americans knew exactly where he was heading. October 24th stretched into the longest day of the battle, opening with a stroke of terrible luck for the Americans at 9:38 in the morning. A single Japanese bomber broke through the combat air patrol and dropped a 551-pound bomb directly onto the light carrier USS Princeton. The bomb punched through the flight deck and exploded below, starting fires that the crew fought hard to control. For a while, it looked like they might save her, and the cruiser USS Birmingham came alongside to help with firefighting efforts. Then Princeton's magazine detonated at 3:12 that afternoon, and the blast was absolutely catastrophic. Birmingham lost 229 men killed instantly. Princeton lost another 108, and the disaster served as a brutal reminder that one bomb in exactly the wrong place could erase a ship that had taken years to build. But the day's main action was unfolding in the Sibuyan Sea, where American carrier aircraft were hunting down Kurita's center force. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes hammered the Japanese ships throughout the daylight hours, and the super battleship Musashi became their primary target. Musashi was a monster of a ship, a 73,000-ton Leviathan protected by armor thick enough to shrug off almost anything. Almost. American pilots kept hitting her again and again, 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes eventually finding their mark, and she kept steaming forward even as compartment after compartment flooded. Her crew fought to save the ship until the very end. But at 7:35 p.m. on October 24th, Musashi finally capsized and went down, taking approximately 1,023 of her 2,399 crew members with her. The sustained attacks appeared to be working. Kurita reversed course at 3:30 p.m. and headed west, seemingly in retreat. But at 5:15 p.m. he turned back east toward San Bernardino Strait. American commanders didn't realize this because they thought they'd beaten him. Meanwhile, Ozawa's northern force had finally been spotted at 4:40 p.m., those decoy carriers that held the key to the entire Japanese plan. And that's when the divided command became absolutely critical. Halsey had sent a message earlier that afternoon stating Task Force 34 will be formed, and Kinkaid's 7th Fleet intercepted this message and assumed it meant Halsey's 6 fast battleships would be stationed to guard San Bernardino Strait. But Halsey meant something entirely different. At 7:50 p.m., he made his decision to take his entire 3rd Fleet north after Ozawa, all his carriers and all his battleships, everything. San Bernardino Strait would be left completely unguarded. Halsey steamed north and Kurita approached the unguarded San Bernardino Strait, but the southern force was about to run straight into a meat grinder. Nishimura's force entered Surigao Strait around 2 a.m. on October 25th, and Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was waiting for them with 6 battleships, 5 of them raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, plus cruisers and destroyers positioned for the perfect ambush. Oldendorf had set the classic trap. Nishimura's ships had to steam up the narrow strait in column formation while the Americans could cross the T by positioning their entire line perpendicular to the enemy. Every American gun could fire while the Japanese could only use their forward turrets, and the slaughter that followed was methodical. Destroyer attacks came first, launching torpedoes from both sides of the strait and scoring hits on both Japanese battleships. Then at 3:16 a.m., the battleship West Virginia acquired targets at 42,000 yards, over 20 miles away, using her radar fire control system. West Virginia opened fire at 3:53 a.m., and her first salvo hit the battleship Yamashiro squarely. American battleships poured shells into the Japanese column for the next half hour. Yamashiro took hit after hit, already damaged from the torpedo attacks, and around 4:20 a.m., she rolled over and sank with Admiral Nishimura still aboard. The battleship Fuso had already broken in half and gone down around 3:40. Shima's force arrived late and saw nothing but destruction ahead, collided with the crippled cruiser Mogami in the confusion, and retreated. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over in a matter of hours. It had been the last battleship duel in history, and it had been utterly one-sided. But none of that mattered because what was happening off Samar would soon overshadow everything. Kurita's center force passed through San Bernardino Strait, unopposed at 12:35 a.m., while the guns were still blazing down at Surigao Strait. By dawn, they were steaming south along the coast of Samar Island, and nobody on the American side had any idea they were coming. Kurita's lookout spotted masts on the horizon at 6:45 a.m. He thought he'd found Halsey's fleet carriers, ordered a general attack, and his ships surged forward at maximum speed. What they'd actually found was Taffy 3, a group of 6 escort carriers screened by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Escort carriers were converted merchant hulls, slow and lightly armored, designed for hunting submarines and providing air support for ground troops rather than fighting surface battles. Sprague's entire task unit displaced less tonnage than the Yamato alone. 18-inch shells from Yamato started falling around the American ships at 7 a.m. Ensign William Brooks spotted the Japanese fleet and radioed back. "I can see pagoda masts. I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw." Sprague did the only thing he could do. He ordered his carriers to head east into the wind to launch aircraft, laid down smoke to hide his ships, and sent his destroyers and destroyer escorts on what amounted to a suicide charge against battleships. Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston didn't bother waiting for orders. Evans was part Cherokee and Creek, and when he'd commissioned Johnston a year earlier, he'd told his crew these words: "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Now he charged his destroyer directly at Kurita's battleships without hesitation. Johnston closed to 10,000 yards, point-blank range in naval terms, and fired a full spread of 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano. The torpedoes hit her bow and knocked her out of action, and then Johnston turned her 5-inch guns on the battleship Congo. A 6.1-inch shell from Yamato hit Johnston's bridge and blew off 2 of Evans' fingers along with his entire shirt. But Evans refused painkillers and kept commanding from the fantail. The destroyer Hoel and destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts joined the charge without hesitation. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of the Samuel B. Roberts had told his crew over the intercom, "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Samuel B. Roberts was a destroyer escort that normally displaced just over 1,000 tons, and now she was charging Japanese heavy cruisers. Her chief engineer, Lieutenant Trowbridge, bypassed every engine safety mechanism to somehow coax 28 knots out of engines rated for 24. Her single 5-inch gun mount fired over 300 rounds in 50 minutes and scored more than 40 hits on heavy cruisers, all while shell splashes from Japanese battleships towered higher than her mast. Meanwhile, aircraft from all the Taffy carriers were throwing everything they had into the fight. Many had launched with anti-submarine weapons or completely empty guns, so pilots made repeated dry runs just to distract Japanese gunners and break up their aim. Some flew to Tacloban airfield, commandeered Army bombs at gunpoint, and flew back to attack the warships. The confused melee ended up saving the carriers. Japanese heavy cruisers kept turning away from torpedo attacks. Smoke obscured their targets, and the constant harassment prevented them from organizing any kind of coordinated attack. But the cost was terrible. The escort carrier Gambier Bay took repeated hits from 8-inch shells and capsized at 9:07 a.m., becoming the only U.S. carrier ever sunk by naval gunfire in World War II. Johnston absorbed hit after hit from multiple Japanese ships. Evans directed the ship by shouting steering orders through an open hatch to men turning the rudder by hand after her bridge was destroyed. Around 9:45 a.m., dead in the water and burning from stem to stern, Johnston was finished. Evans ordered abandoned ship and was last seen on the fantail. His body was never recovered. Something remarkable happened as Johnston went down. The Japanese destroyer Yukikaze approached, and her captain, Terauchi Masamichi, was observed saluting the sinking American destroyer while his crew lined the deck at attention. Survivor Robert Billy reported that Commander Evans, sitting in a lifeboat, was seen saluting back with tears in his eyes. Hoel sank. Samuel B. Roberts sank. And of Johnston's 327 crew, only 141 survived. 92 men who were alive after the sinking died from sharks, exposure, and dehydration during 50 to 70 hours in the water before rescue came. And then at 9:11 a.m., something completely inexplicable happened. Kurita ordered withdrawal with the words, "All ships, my course north." His force turned around and headed back toward San Bernardino Strait. Leyte Gulf lay wide open before him with barely defended American transports. He still had 4 battleships and 6 cruisers operational, but he withdrew anyway. Admiral Sprague wrote afterward, "The failure of the enemy main body and encircling light forces to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our torpedo counterattack, continuous harassment of enemy by bomb, torpedo and strafing air attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God." Historian Samuel Eliot Morison put it this way, "In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 07:30 and 09:30 off Samar." The battle wasn't quite finished for Taffy 3. Around 10:51 a.m., a Japanese Zero deliberately crashed into the escort carrier St. Lo, which exploded and sank in less than 30 minutes. It was the first major ship sunk by what would soon be called kamikaze, meaning divine wind. Halsey was 300 miles to the north doing exactly what Ozawa wanted him to do, while Taffy 3 fought for survival. The Japanese decoy had worked perfectly, maybe too perfectly. American aircraft located Ozawa's northern force at 7:10 a.m., and the first strikes hit at 8 a.m. Over the course of the day, American planes destroyed all 4 of Ozawa's carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. Zuikaku was the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, and now she was gone too. Ozawa had accomplished his mission completely. He'd pulled Halsey away from Leyte Gulf just as planned. But the problem was that Kurita didn't know any of this had worked. Around 10 a.m., while Halsey's planes were pounding the Japanese carriers, he received an urgent message from Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. It read, "Where is Task Force 34? Then came what appeared to be the rest of the message. "The world wonders." Halsey thought Nimitz was publicly ridiculing him in front of the entire fleet. The phrase, "the world wonders," was actually just message padding, a random phrase added to prevent enemy code breakers from recognizing message patterns. But the padding made it through as if it were part of the actual message. Halsey was reportedly so enraged he threw his cap on the deck and wept with frustration. But the message accomplished what Nimitz intended, and at 11:15 a.m., Halsey finally ordered Task Force 34 to turn south. By the time his battleships arrived, Kurita had already retreated back through San Bernardino Strait, and the chance to intercept him was gone. Two decisions made during the Battle of Leyte Gulf have fueled arguments among historians for 80 years now. The first decision was Halsey taking his entire fleet north and leaving San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. His critics, including the official Navy historian Samuel Eliot Morison, labeled it Halsey's blunder, and Admiral Leahy said Halsey went off on a little war of his own. Halsey's defenders point out that his orders authorized pursuit of major enemy fleet forces. Carriers represented the greatest threat in modern naval warfare, and he had no way of knowing Ozawa's carriers were nearly empty of aircraft. The fundamental problem was the divided command structure, not any single decision Halsey made. Nimitz wrote privately to Admiral King after the battle, "It never occurred to me that Halsey, knowing the composition of the ships in the Sibuyan Sea, would leave the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. That the San Bernardino detachment of the Japanese fleet did not completely destroy all of the escort carriers is nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty." Modern historians, including Mark Stilla's 2023 book, argue that the command structure deserves more blame than Halsey's individual judgment. Two fleet commanders with two chains of command operating in the same battle space was asking for disaster. The second controversy centers on Kurita's retreat. Why did he turn back when Leyte Gulf lay wide open before him, with virtually no defenses left? Some accused him of cowardice, and he was removed from command in December 1944 following the battle. But the truth probably involves more complexity than that. Kurita had been awake on Yamato's bridge for nearly 48 hours straight. His flagship had been sunk under him 2 days earlier. His force had been under constant air attack, and he believed he was facing fleet carriers rather than escort carriers. He had no air cover and no way to know that Ozawa's decoy mission had actually succeeded. Mark Stilla argues that the idea Kurita could have achieved any kind of great victory is utter nonsense given the circumstances. By the time he withdrew, American aircraft were converging from multiple directions, and without air cover, his ships would have been destroyed one by one in the Gulf. Still, the question haunts the historical record. What if Kurita had pressed on? Final air strikes on retreating Japanese forces on October 26, 1944, marked the end of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. When everything was counted up, Japan had lost 26 warships, totaling approximately 305,710 tons, 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The United States lost 7 ships, totaling 37,300 tons, 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and a PT boat. More importantly, Japan lost approximately 10 to 12,500 men, while the United States lost around 2,800 to 3,000. About half the American deaths came from kamikaze attacks, a grim preview of what the next 10 months would bring. The Japanese Navy still existed on paper when the battle ended, but it was finished as a fighting force, and Toyota had understood this would happen before the battle even started. He'd said, "Should we lose in the Philippines operations, even though the fleet should be left, the shipping lane to the south would be completely cut off, so that the fleet, if it should come back to Japanese waters, could not obtain its fuel supply. There would be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines." He was right about everything. The remaining Japanese ships sat stranded in port for lack of fuel, and their only significant sortie would come in April 1945, when Yamato made a one-way suicide run toward Okinawa and got destroyed by aircraft before she even got close. MacArthur's beachhead was secure. The path to Luzon, Manila, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa lay wide open. The war would grind on for 10 more terrible months, but Japan's defeat was now mathematically inevitable. The ships and men who fought at Leyte Gulf haven't been forgotten in the 80 years since the battle. Commander Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously, becoming the first Native American to receive the Navy's highest award in World War II. A Navy training facility in Newport now houses the Evans Full Mission Bridge Simulator in his honor. The story of Taffy 3 became the stuff of legend. Samuel B. Roberts earned the nickname the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, and James Hornfisher's 2004 book, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, brought their story to an entirely new generation of readers. Underwater explorers have found the wrecks in recent years. Paul Allen's expedition discovered Musashi in March 2015, sitting in 3,280 feet of water in the Sibuyan Sea, and survivor Shigeru Nakajima, then 94 years old, confirmed the identification. The research vessel Petrel found Johnston in October 2019, and explorer Victor Vescovo surveyed her in detail at 21,180 feet in March 2021, making her the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed at that time. The hull number 557 was clearly visible on the wreck, as was an 18.1-inch shell hole from Yamato. Vescovo found Samuel B. Roberts in June 2022 at 22,523 feet, now holding the record as the world's deepest known shipwreck. Ceremonies commemorating the 80th anniversary took place in October 2024 at the MacArthur Landing Memorial in Leyte, at the Intrepid Museum in New York, and at the MacArthur Memorial in Virginia. The commanding officer of USS Leyte Gulf, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, still in active service and named for the battle, participated in the commemorations. Japanese survivors who are now centenarians have given interviews in recent years, and veterans on both sides have expressed respect for their former enemies. The salute exchanged between Johnston and Yuki-kaze stands as a symbol that even in the midst of terrible violence, there could still be recognition of courage and sacrifice. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history. More than 200,000 men fought across 4 separate engagements, spanning 4 days and over 100,000 square miles, and when it ended, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been destroyed as an effective force while the road to Tokyo lay wide open. But the significance of this battle goes well beyond the statistics. It showed what happens when command gets divided between competing authorities, raised questions about aggressive action versus prudent defense that tacticians still argue about today, and demonstrated that even overwhelming material superiority doesn't guarantee victory without skilled execution. What happened off Samar stands out even among all the other remarkable events of those 4 days. The men of Taffy 3, sailors on escort carriers and destroyers who charged straight at battleships, wrote a story that seems almost impossible to believe. Yet it happened exactly as described. Commander Evans and Lieutenant Commander Copeland and all the others who went in harm's way bought time with their lives for Sprague's carriers to escape, and they disrupted the Japanese attack so thoroughly that Admiral Kurita, who should have won by every rational calculation, lost his nerve and retreated instead. 5 battleships raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor got their revenge at Surigao Strait in the end. Halsey's carriers destroyed Ozawa's decoy force at Cape Engano, and a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts became legends off the coast of Samar. That's the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history and one of the most remarkable stories to come out of the entire Second World War.